She arrived at the orchard gate with nothing but a swollen belly, a canvas bag held together by a single brass buckle, and the particular kind of quiet that only comes after a person has been told no enough times that they've stopped flinching at the word. The town behind her had made itself clear. Every door, every face, every turned shoulder. And now the last light of autumn was bleeding out across a dead orchard, and the man standing in the yard looked like he wanted to say no too. But something made him hesitate. That hesitation was the only thing standing between Alara Whitmore and the open road with nowhere left to go. If this story stays with you, hit like, leave a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this has traveled. The orchard had been dying for 3 years before she showed up. Gideon Hart knew this the way a man knows a sickness he has stopped naming. Not because it stopped being real, but because giving it a name every morning would have made it impossible to get out of bed. The apple trees along the south fence had gone to scale and blight. Half the pear stalk was dropping fruit before it ever ripened, the ground beneath littered with small hard bodies that split and blackened in the wet. The chicken coop had 3 fewer birds than last month, and he wasn't entirely sure where they'd gone. The front porch steps had a soft spot on the second board that he kept meaning to fix and never did, and the kitchen had smelled faintly of mildew since August, because the window above the basin no longer sealed properly against rain. He had 43 acres and a farmhouse that was holding itself together mostly out of habit. That was the Tuesday afternoon in late October when he looked up from the fence post. He was reseeding along the eastern boundary and saw a woman standing at the gate. She wasn't knocking. She wasn't calling out. She was simply standing there with one hand resting on the iron latch, and her body turned slightly sideways the way pregnant women sometimes stand when they've been walking too long and need to ease the weight off one hip. She was wearing a dark green coat that had been good quality once and was now several seasons past it, and she had a canvas bag hanging from her left shoulder that appeared to be held together by prayer and a single brass buckle. Gideon set down the post driver and walked toward the gate. He was not a man who hurried toward strangers. By the time he reached her, he had taken her measure the way a man alone on a farm learns to take measure of things that arrive unannounced, looking for what was off, what was missing, what the presentation was designed to conceal. What he found was this: a woman who was somewhere between 25 and 30, dark-haired, hollow around the eyes, in a way that spoke of not enough sleep for longer than a few days, a jaw set with the particular stubbornness of someone who had made a decision and was committed to it, even if the decision terrified her. She was further along than he'd initially registered, 7 months, maybe 8. The coat was doing its best, but the coat was losing. "Mr. Hart," she said. He stopped a few feet from the gate. "You have the advantage of me." Alara Whitmore. She did not offer her hand. Both hands were occupied, one on the latch, one pressing into her lower back. "I was told in town that you might be looking for harvest help." Gideon looked at her for a moment without answering, and then he looked past her down the lane toward the road, because there should have been a wagon or a horse, or at minimum a second person accompanying anyone who'd come out this far on foot in her condition. There was nothing. Just the lane running straight between the fence rows, the poplars along the east side stripped down to bare branches, the pale October sky doing nothing to warm anything. "Who told you that?" he said. "Woman at the dry goods store." A beat. "She told me after I asked at the boarding house, and the mill, and the church." He understood then. Not the details. He didn't need the details. He understood the shape of what had happened. "The boarding house turned you away," he said. "They were full." They both knew the boarding house had had vacancies. Gideon had seen the sign himself not 2 weeks before. "How far did you walk from town?" 4 miles, roughly." He looked at the bag. He looked at the state of her boots, which were a practical lace-up style that had seen significant use. He looked at the orchard behind him, the littered ground, the skeletal trees, the shed along the north fence, with the door that hung crooked on its hinges because the frame had warped last winter. "I'm not looking for harvest help," he said. She nodded once, slowly, like she'd been expecting this, like she'd been collecting these particular nods all day and had run out of the energy to be wounded by them. "I know what the orchard looks like," she said. "I could see it from the lane." She turned her head toward the south fence where the worst of the apple trees stood. "Crown rot on those 3. The ones along the back fence have fire blight that wasn't treated this spring. You can still save some of them if you prune before the first hard freeze. The pears are dropping early because of the soil drainage. That's fixable." She looked back at him. I grew up on an orchard in the valley. I know what I'm looking at. Gideon said nothing. I'm not asking for wages, she said. I'm asking for a place to stay until the baby comes. I'll work in exchange. The harvest, what's left of it, preserving. Whatever needs doing in the house. She said it without inflection, without pleading, which struck him as both admirable and slightly alarming. She'd rehearsed this. She'd been rehearsing it since the boarding house. Maybe since longer than that. I won't be a burden past what I have to be. Once the baby comes and I'm able to travel, I'll move on. And where will you move on to? The question landed and she absorbed it, and he watched something cross her face that she controlled before it finished crossing. I'll figure that out when the time comes. Gideon had been alone on this farm for 2 years, 4 months, and approximately 11 days. He was not a man who tracked time in a morbid way. It was simply that the days had a quality to them since Margaret died that made themselves memorable, whether he wanted them to be or not. He had learned to live with silence the way you live with a missing tooth. You know it's gone. You stop running your tongue over the gap. You find a way to chew on the other side. He had grown accustomed to the echo of his own boots on the kitchen floor. He had grown accustomed to meals that existed purely for function. He had grown accustomed to the farm's slow decline in a way that probably should have alarmed him more than it did. He looked at this woman standing at his gate in a coat that wasn't warm enough for what was coming, carrying everything she owned, asking for shelter with the specific dignity of someone who had long since burned through the part of themselves that could afford pride. The shed along the north fence has a stove, he said. The flue needs cleaning before you light it. I'll clean it tonight. He unlatched the gate and pulled it open. I eat at 6. Breakfast at 5:30 if you're working. You'll need to tell me if something's wrong with the baby. I don't know enough about that to guess. He turned and walked back toward the fence post. Behind him, after a moment, he heard her footsteps on the gravel. Her name was Elara Whitmore, and she had been raised on an orchard called the Whitmore Family Farm in a valley about 60 miles south and east of here, the third of 4 children, and the only one who'd ever actually cared about the trees. She did not tell Gideon any of this on that first day. She told him very little that first day. She put her bag in the shed, which was cold and smelled of old oil, and had a cot along one wall that she suspected had belonged to a farmhand who hadn't been employed here in some time. And she cleaned the flue herself before he got to it, using a rag she found on a nail and working by feel in the dark interior of the chimney stack. Gideon found her doing this when he came to the shed at dusk, and stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. I said I'd do that, he said. I did it. She pulled the rag out and inspected it, and it was thick with creosote and ash. The flue's clear now. You'll want to look at the connector pipe, too. There's a gap in the seal. He looked at the connector pipe. There was a gap in the seal. She lit the stove herself that first night, using 3 pieces of wood from the stack by the north fence and a handful of wood shavings she found in a coffee tin near the door. And when the fire had caught, she sat on the edge of the cot and pressed both hands against her belly and was quiet for a while. The baby moved. She could feel it, a specific rolling pressure that started under her ribs and tracked down toward her hip, and she put one hand on that side and held it there. We're all right, she told it, because it was the kind of thing she needed to say out loud. We have a roof tonight. The first morning she was out before 5. Gideon came down the back steps at 5:15, expecting to find her still in the shed, expecting, if he was being honest with himself, to find that she'd taken stock of the situation in the cold, clear light of morning and slipped away down the lane in the night. That happened. People arrived desperate and then reconsidered. He couldn't blame them for it. Instead, he found her in the orchard. She was in among the south fence apple trees, moving slowly in the gray pre-dawn light, with a lantern hung from a low branch, examining the bark on one of the crown-wrought trees with both hands and her face close to the wood. She had changed her coat for a heavy work jacket that was too big for her, probably taken from a pile of left-behind things in the shed, and she'd wrapped a length of cloth around her waist to support the weight of the pregnancy, a thing he'd seen older women do sometimes, and had never understood the mechanics of until he saw it in practice. He stood at the edge of the orchard and watched her work. She examined 3 trees, made notes in a small book she carried in her jacket pocket, and then moved along the fence row toward the pear block and started there. She did not appear to notice him. Breakfast, he said. She looked up. I need to check the drainage at the base of these trees first. Do you have a spade I can use? After breakfast, she considered this, seemed to weigh the trees against the spade against the fact that she was 8 months pregnant and had walked 4 miles yesterday and eaten, as far as he knew, nothing since arriving. And then she came back through the orchard toward the house. Breakfast at the Hart farm that first morning consisted of oats, 2 fried eggs each, and coffee, and it was conducted in the particular silence of two strangers who have not yet established the rules of a shared space. Gideon ate at one end of the kitchen table. Elara ate at the other end. There was a newspaper between them that neither of them read. Halfway through the meal, she said, "You'll need to let me prune the south fence trees before the freeze hits, or you'll lose them." "When's the freeze?" 10 days if the weather holds. Less if the wind shifts north. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "The blight on the back fence is worse than I thought. You'll lose about a third of those trees regardless. But the rest can be saved if we get the dead wood out fast." "We," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I know how to prune, Mr. Hart. I'm pregnant, not incapable." "You're 8 months pregnant, 7.5." She set down the cup. "I also know how to preserve. If we can get the remaining harvest in before the rot takes the rest, I can put up enough apple butter and pear preserves to last through winter and have extra to sell in the spring. The kind of extra that might actually matter for a farm that needs it." She said this last part without judgment, simply as observation, and it landed the way observations stated plainly always land, harder than accusations. Gideon looked at his oats. "The pruning shears are in the barn, south wall." She worked every day from before dawn until the light gave out, and she worked with the specific unhurried efficiency of someone who had been doing this since childhood and had no need to prove anything about it. The first week she concentrated on the orchard. She pruned the south fence trees with a deftness that Gideon watched from a distance and couldn't quite reconcile with her condition. She moved carefully, planning each cut before she made it, keeping her weight low, refusing the ladder for high cuts and instead working around them methodically on the ground. When he brought the ladder to her anyway, she used it for exactly 2 cuts, and then left it leaning against a tree trunk and returned to working without it. The fire blight on the back fence trees was bad. She had been right about that. She worked through the dead wood with a bone saw and a pair of long-handled loppers, and she was meticulous about burning what she cut, feeding the pile herself, and standing back from the smoke with her coat drawn up over her nose. 3 trees were too far gone. She told Gideon on a Wednesday afternoon, standing at the fence row with sawdust on her jacket and her braid coming loose. "The 3 on the east end," she said. "They're done. You need to take them out entirely, roots if you can manage it, and treat the soil before you replant." "We're not replanting this season." "No, but you need to treat the soil now or it'll hold the blight for next season." He had not thought about next season in any practical way for quite some time. "What do you treat it with?" he said. She told him. It involved lime and a composting process and rotating the ground with a nitrogen-fixing cover crop through the winter, and she explained it the way his father had explained things to him, without simplifying, without checking to see if he was following, trusting him to keep up. By the end of the first week, 10 of the pear trees along the south drainage had been re-leveled using wooden shims under their root crowns, a thing Elara accomplished by studying the waterlogged depressions around the base of each tree, and then spending 2 full days redirecting the drainage channels with a spade, and a lot of heavy shoveling that Gideon had to stop himself from taking over because she waved him off every time he reached for the spade, and he had learned already that she knew what she was doing. The remaining fruit, the apples that had come through October without rotting, the late pears, a quantity of hard quinces from a tree along the north fence that Gideon had forgotten was even bearing, she began processing in the second week. He came into the kitchen the Monday of the second week and found the table covered in organized disaster. Jars in various stages of cleaning, a canning pot the size of a small barrel on the stove, 3 kinds of fruit in graduated stages of processing along the counter, and Elara standing in the middle of it all, in a work apron, a jar of something amber and fragrant cooling in her hands. "The quince," she said, holding it up. "Good year for it. I put up 12 jars of paste and 4 of jelly. The jelly's loose. I'll reprocess it tomorrow." "Where did you find all those jars?" "The cellar. There are probably 40 more down there that haven't been used in a couple of years. I washed what I needed." She set the quince jelly on the counter. "You should know that you're nearly out of salt. And the canning lids. I used what you had and I'll need more by the end of the week." He looked at the kitchen, at the ordered rows of jars beginning to accumulate on the counter, amber and gold and deep red, at the pot on the stove. at the single candle she'd lit on the windowsill against the gray afternoon light, casting a small warm circle in the kitchen's corner. "I'll get the salt and lids in town Thursday," he said, "and white sugar if there's room in the budget." "There's room." She nodded and turned back to the stove, and he stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment longer than was necessary before he went out to deal with the fence along the west pasture. She moved into the house at the end of the second week. This happened less by decision than by accumulation. The shed was cold in ways the stove couldn't fully address. The gap in the connector seal let heat escape, and the walls were single-board construction with no insulation, and at night the temperature was dropping into the low 30s. Gideon had noticed that she was coming into the house earlier each evening, sitting in the kitchen chair closest to the range, with both hands wrapped around a cup until she was warm enough to go back out. On a Thursday night, he said, "The upstairs room on the south side stays warmer. The house is better insulated than the shed." She looked up from her cup. "I'm fine in the shed. You're coming in here to warm up every night. I can get another blanket." "You can take the room," he said. He got up and put his own cup in the basin. "I'm not suggesting anything by it. The room's empty. It's more practical." She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her calculating. The cold, the baby, the practical reality of what another 3 or 4 weeks in that shed would mean, against whatever it cost her to accept more than she'd asked for. "I'll move my bag tomorrow," she said. The south room had been a guest room at some point, and before that had been his daughter's room, briefly, and it had clean curtains and a bed with a quilt and a washstand in the corner, and when Elara moved her bag into it the following morning, she stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the curtains, white cotton with a small embroidered border. And she said, "These are nice," and he said, "My wife made them," and neither of them said anything else about it. The livestock were another thing entirely. The Hart farm had, in various states of cooperation, 2 draft horses named August, and a younger gelding called Pitch that had come with the farm when Gideon bought the adjacent 10 acres 2 years ago and had been a problem ever since. Pitch had run 3 different farm hands off. He bit. He kicked at the stall boards. He refused the bit from anyone except, apparently, from Margaret, who had worked with him for 6 months before she got sick, and after that no one had been able to do much with him. Gideon tolerated the horse the way he tolerated a lot of things on the farm that weren't worth the fight. He worked around him, kept the stall clean from a safe distance, and used the draft horses for any actual work. He came into the barn on the Saturday of the 3rd week to find Elara in Pitch's stall, not near the stall, in it. Standing at the horse's shoulder with one hand flat on his neck, talking to him in a low voice. Not the soft, meaningless murmuring some people used on animals, but actual sentences, a steady conversational tone, like she was telling him something useful. Gideon stopped just inside the barn door. Pitch was standing still. Pitch was not kicking. Pitch's ears were forward, and his jaw was relaxed, and he was leaning, almost imperceptibly, toward the woman standing at his shoulder. Elara was saying, "Not asking for much. Just stay where I put you, that's all. Just stand still." She ran her hand down his neck, across his shoulder, down his foreleg, and Pitch let her. The horse made a sound, shar, not a squeal, not a warning, a low breath, almost a sigh. Gideon backed out of the barn without speaking. Later, at supper, he said, "How did you do that?" She looked up. "What?" "Pitch. He's bitten 2 men I know of." She looked back at her plate, pushed something around with her fork. "He's scared. That's why he bites. You have to let scared things tell you when they're ready." She picked up her fork. "He's not mean. He's been mean to him. That's different." "Who's been mean to him?" "I don't know. Whoever had him before." She ate. "He'll be all right. He needs time." His neighbor Silas Granger came to the farm on a Wednesday morning in the 4th week. Silas Granger owned the property to the north and a significant amount of the social architecture of the surrounding community. He sat on the church council and the town board and the informal committee of men who met at the hardware store on Friday afternoons and decided things. He was not, strictly speaking, a bad man. He was a man who had learned that comfort was best maintained by managing what happened near it, and anything that threatened to complicate the established order of things made him uncomfortable in ways he had long since stopped distinguishing from moral conviction. He arrived in a wagon with his eldest son, which was a way of arriving that communicated he wanted witnesses. Gideon was mending the north fence when he heard them on the lane. He walked out to meet them at the gate. "Gideon." Silas climbed down from the wagon with the careful movements of a man who had maintained his weight reasonably well into middle age and was not about to rush anything. He had a handshake that communicated authority without warmth. Thought it was time we talked. About what? Silas looked over Gideon's shoulder toward the house, which was visible through the bare orchard. About the woman staying here. Her name is Alara Whitmore. She's been helping with the harvest. People are talking, Gideon. People talk about most things. Silas's jaw tightened slightly. He had the face of a man who found patience for other people's stubbornness genuinely difficult to locate. This isn't a small thing, an unmarried woman living under your roof in her condition. The kind of talk that comes from that is other people's business, Gideon said. It becomes your business when it starts affecting yours. Silas put one boot on the fence post, a territorial gesture that Gideon had seen him use before. You've got contracts with 3 orchards to the north who sell through the co-op I run. You know that. You want those contracts to keep, you need to think about what you're doing to your reputation. Gideon looked at him, at his son in the wagon seat who was staring at the middle distance with the particular expression of someone trying to look like they weren't there. What I'm doing, Gideon said, is trying to keep a farm alive. He kept his voice level. It took some effort. She knows orchards. She knows preservation. She's been saving what's left of this harvest. Whether you and the church council approve of the arrangement is not a thing I'm thinking about. I'm telling you, Silas said, as a neighbor and a friend. You're telling me as a man who wants things to stay the way you're used to them being. Gideon stepped back and pulled the gate in slightly, a clear adjustment of the territory. I appreciate you coming out. You're welcome back when there's something else to discuss. Silas stood at the fence for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then he climbed back into the wagon. You're making a mistake, Gideon, he said. I hope you'll think on it. The wagon turned on the lane and went north. Alara was at the kitchen table when he came in, working on labels for the preserve jars. She had good handwriting, clean and practical, without flourish. She did not look up when he came through the door, but something in the set of her shoulders told him she had watched from the window. He'll be back, she said. Probably. She pressed the label flat against the jar. I can go. If it's causing you trouble. It's not, he said. She looked up at him then. He went to the stove and poured himself coffee. He stood at the counter with his back to her for a moment. You pruned the back fence trees, he said. You put up nearly 100 jars of preserves in 3 weeks. You fixed the drainage on the south pear block and calmed a horse nobody else could get near. You moved into the south room because the shed was going to freeze you. He turned around. You're not a problem I need to solve, Mrs. Whitmore. You're the reason there's going to be anything left to sell in the spring. She looked at the jar in her hands for a moment. Miss, she said quietly. What? Miss Whitmore, not Mrs. He hadn't asked. He'd assumed, the way people assume with a pregnant woman, and now he felt the weight of that assumption and what it had probably cost her everywhere she'd been before here. Right, he said. Miss Whitmore. He set his cup down. Silas Granger can find other business to mind. She went back to her labels. He went back to his coffee. Outside, the light was coming through the kitchen window in long, flat bars, the way it does in autumn, throwing everything into relief. The jar she was labeling, the steam from the canning pot, the small, neat stacks of finished preserves along the counter. And Gideon Hart stood in his kitchen and thought about how the house had smelled of mildew in August, and now it smelled of quince and apples and wood smoke, and that had happened slowly enough that he hadn't noticed exactly when, and that seemed like something worth paying attention to. By the 5th week, the inventory in the cellar had been transformed. What had been bare shelves and empty crates was now organized in rows that Alara had labeled and cataloged in a small notebook she kept on the shelf by the cellar door. Apple butter, apple jelly, spiced apple rings, pear preserves, quince paste, quince jelly, pickled beets from the garden that had been going to seed along the east fence, dried apple rings, dried pear slices, pickled green tomatoes from the last of the kitchen garden. There were 114 jars in total. She told him this on a Tuesday night at supper with a matter-of-factness that made him set down his fork. 114, he said, give or take. 3 of the apple butter jars didn't seal, and I'll need to reprocess them. She ate. That's enough to last through winter with a surplus to sell. The quince paste especially, that sells well in the city markets. If you can get it to the right buyer, that's not nothing. He looked at her. You said the baby was coming in December. Around then. Could be late November. It's November the 3rd. I know what month it is, Mr. Hart. Are you? He stopped. He was not good at asking these questions. He had never been particularly good at them, even when Margaret was alive, and she had tolerated it with an affectionate impatience that he had not known to be grateful for until she was gone. Are you all right? The baby? She was quiet for a moment. The baby's healthy, as far as I can tell, she said. It moves plenty. Too much some nights. She put down her fork. I'm tired in a way I can't sleep off, but that's... She made a small gesture. That's just what it is. He nodded. Okay, he said, and he meant several things by it that he didn't have the words to separate out, and she seemed to understand this because she just picked up her fork again and went back to eating, and the kitchen held its silence comfortably, the way it had been learning to do so. The snow held off through most of November, teasing at the edges, a light frost on the lower pasture, ice in the water trough some mornings, the kind of cold that settled in and didn't leave but also didn't commit. Alara learned the farm's rhythms in the specific way you learn them when you're living inside them. The draft horses needed water before they'd eat in cold weather. You had to pour a little warm water in first. The rooster was unreliable as a clock, but the hens weren't. The south-facing slope of the east pasture lost its frost an hour before the north end, which meant you could graze the sheep there on mornings that seemed too cold for it. Gideon watched her learn these things and did not comment on them, which was the Hart family way of showing approval. On a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of November, she was feeding the chickens in the yard, when she stopped, went very still, and stood with her hand pressed flat against her side. He was on the porch watching. He came down the steps before he decided to. Alara, I'm fine, she said. She didn't move yet. What is it? A contraction. She kept her voice even. Could be Braxton Hicks. I've been having them on and off for a week. She straightened carefully. It's past. He stood next to her in the yard with the chickens milling around both of them. You should have said something, he said. There's nothing to say. They're normal at this stage. She picked up the feed bucket again. I'm not going to fall apart, Mr. Hart. I know that. He took the bucket from her. She looked at him. I'll do the chickens, he said. Go sit down. She looked like she was going to argue, and then something in the set of his jaw apparently communicated that this particular discussion was over, and she handed him the bucket and went back inside. He stood in the yard feeding chickens in the cold November morning and thought about Margaret dying in the upstairs room, which had taken 3 months and which he would not think about in detail because there were things you didn't take out and examine too often if you intended to remain functional. He thought about the south room where Alara was sleeping now, where the white curtains were. He thought about the baby that was coming in December, or late November, approximately, into a farmhouse with no doctor closer than 4 miles and roads that would ice over in a serious storm. He scattered the last of the feed. He went back inside, and the November sky above the orchard went gray in the way it goes when it has made a decision. The first proper snow came that afternoon. Just a few inches, soft and dry, settling into the branches of the apple trees and covering the rotted ground beneath them, making the orchard look clean. Alara stood at the kitchen window and looked out at it, and Gideon came to stand beside her without quite meaning to, and they both looked at the snow on the trees and the white ground and the orchard that was neither thriving nor dead, but somewhere in the difficult territory between. It's a start, she said. He wasn't sure if she meant the snow or the orchard or something else entirely. Yeah, he said, it is. The snow from that first afternoon didn't stay long. By Thursday morning it had softened to slush, and by Friday it was gone, leaving the orchard floor dark and wet, the ruts in the lane filled with cold brown water that froze at night and thawed through the day in the particular indecisive way of early winter in this part of the country. But it had announced itself, and everyone on the farm, the horses, the livestock, the 2 people living in the house, felt the shift in the quality of time. There was an urgency now that hadn't been there in October. The cold wasn't coming. The cold was here and merely deciding how serious to be. Alara worked like someone who understood this urgency in her bones. She had finished the last of the preserving by the 1st week of November, and with the cellar organized and the harvest secured, she turned her attention to the house itself. Not in the way of a woman staking a claim, but in the practical way of someone who could see clearly what was needed and had the skills to address it. The kitchen window that hadn't sealed properly since August, she recocked herself using a putty knife she found in the barn and a tin of sealant on the tool shelf. She asked Gideon once where he kept the spare lamp oil, and when he pointed her to the back pantry, she spent an afternoon inventorying what was there and what wasn't, and gave him a list the next morning written in her clean, practical hand. Lamp oil, 2 wicks, salt, baking soda, a new sealing ring for the canning pot, wool yarn if there was any to be had. He took the list to town on a Thursday. He stood at the dry goods counter with the list in his hand, and the man behind the counter, Ed Ferris, who had known Gideon's father and had sold Gideon his first pound of nails at the age of 9, read it over twice in a way that communicated he was reading more than the items on it. "How's the farm going?" Ed said, which was not what he was asking. "Better than it was," Gideon said, which answered what was actually being asked. "I'll take everything on the list plus 2 pounds of the good coffee." Ed packed the order without further comment, which was the closest thing to approval Gideon was going to get from that quarter, and Gideon drove home through the gray November afternoon with the supplies in the wagon bed and the quiet satisfaction of having not explained himself to anyone. He brought the bags in through the kitchen door and set them on the table, and Alara was there sorting through them before he'd gotten his coat off, checking items against the list in her head. She pulled out the wool yarn. He'd found a good dark blue at the dry goods and added it without being asked, and held it up. "This wasn't on the list," she said. "Seemed useful." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read. "It is useful. Thank you." She folded it and set it aside. The following week settled into a rhythm that Gideon hadn't known since before Margaret got sick, the specific rhythm of a house with 2 people in it who have found their way around each other without colliding. Mornings were early and quiet. He was out to the barn by 5, she was in the kitchen by 5:30, and they ate breakfast in the manner they'd developed over weeks of practice, trading information about the day's work across the table, the way 2 people manage a shared enterprise. He told her about the fence section on the west pasture that needed restringing before the sheep pushed through it. She told him the back storeroom had a mouse problem that was going to reach the grain if he didn't deal with it. He said he'd set traps. She said she'd already set 2, and where did he keep the extra snap traps? He told her. She nodded. They ate. It was not, he understood, a relationship with a name he knew how to use. It was something that had grown out of necessity and proximity and the particular human instinct to function together when the alternative is to fail apart. But there were evenings. The evenings were a different thing from the mornings. In the mornings, there was work to organize and the day ahead to manage, and that gave the conversation a purpose that kept it safely practical. In the evenings, after supper, when the lamps were lit and the fire in the parlor was going and the wind had started moving seriously through the bare branches outside, there was no practical conversation left to hide inside. He had started a habit, sometime in the 3rd week of November, of bringing his chair closer to the fire after supper, rather than retreating to the back room where he'd been spending his evenings since Margaret died. He told himself it was because the back room was colder. This was true, but it was not the whole truth. Alara sat in the chair opposite, knitting with the blue yarn, which was turning into something, a small garment, a cap, perhaps. He wasn't certain enough about the mechanics to identify it. She knitted the way she did most things, with concentration and without performance. One evening she asked him about the orchard, not about its current state, which they discussed every day, but about its history, how long his family had had it, what it had been like before. "My father bought the land in 1881, Gideon said. He was looking at the fire. He planted the first 30 trees himself, apple and pear, because that's what the soil would take. He used to say a man who plants a tree is making a statement about the future." He paused. I was never sure if he meant that as an encouraging thing or a burden. Alara's needles slowed. "It sounds like both." "Yeah." He shifted in the chair. "The orchard was good through the 80s. My mother ran the preserving, and my father did the growing, and I did what they told me. When Margaret and I married, she had ideas about expanding. She wanted to try stone fruit on the south slope. We got 3 plum trees in before she got sick." He didn't say the rest. He didn't need to. "The plum trees," Alara said carefully, "are those the 3 along the south slope with the iron marker stakes?" "Yes. They're healthy. They need pruning in the spring, but they're bearing. You'll get fruit from them next summer if the weather cooperates." He looked at her. She was watching him over her knitting with a directness that wasn't aggressive, just honest. And he understood she was telling him something more than botanical information. "All right," he said, "I thought you should know." "I'm glad you told me." She went back to her knitting. He went back to watching the fire. The wind moved in the trees outside and the house held itself around them, creaking occasionally in the cold the way old houses do, not in distress but in acknowledgement of the weather. She said, after a while, "I haven't told you very much about where I came from." "You don't have to. I know I don't." She finished a row, turned the needles. "My father's orchard was about 60 miles south of here, valley country. Good growing land, better than this." She said that last part without apology. It was just true. "I was the one who wanted to stay and work it. My brothers were both gone by the time I was 18. One to the railroad, one to a wife in the city. My father was sick for the last 2 years. I kept the orchard running." Her needles moved. "When he died, the orchard went to my oldest brother by the terms of the will, because that's how it works. He sold it in 6 months to a land company. He thought it was impractical." Gideon said nothing. He didn't have anything useful to say, and he'd learned early in his life that filling silence with noise was not the same as responding to something. "I had a position for a while, in a household to the south," she said. "That's where—" She paused, resumed. "That's where the baby comes from, the man of that household." Her voice was very controlled. "He's married." He was clear about that once the situation became evident. His wife was less interested in my explanation than in my departure. She said it flatly, without apparent bid for sympathy, the way you say a thing you've said enough times to yourself that the sharp edges have worn down to something you can handle. But he knew, because he'd been paying attention, that the smoothness was the scar tissue and not the original wound. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm not." She looked up briefly. "About the baby, I mean. Not him. She's mine, and I wanted her before I knew what I was dealing with." She paused. "I think it's a girl. I've thought so since June." "You could be wrong." "I could be." She almost smiled. "But I don't think I am." He considered this. "What will you name her?" She was quiet for a long time, working the needles. "Clara," she said finally. "My mother's name was Clara." He nodded. Outside, the wind shifted direction and pushed a burst of cold through the gap under the back door, and both of them felt it. And Gideon got up and rolled a towel and pressed it against the gap, and then came back and sat down. And Alara said, "I'll fix that properly tomorrow." And he said, "All right." And the evening continued. Those hours by the fire, they accumulated into something over the weeks of November. Neither of them named it. Naming things was dangerous in situations where you couldn't afford the consequences of being wrong. But the hours were there, and they were real, and they changed the quality of the silence between two people in the way that significant things do, quietly and without announcement. It was in this same period that the orchard began to be noticed. The neighbors to the east, the Pemberton family, came past the fence one Saturday morning in mid-November and slowed their wagon to look. The apple trees along the south fence, properly pruned and treated now, had lost the desolate skeletal look that comes from neglect. They stood clean and purposeful, the wounds of pruning sealed, the ground beneath them raked of rot. The drainage channels along the pear block were visible from the road if you knew what you were looking at. The farm had the look of somewhere that was being tended. Old Ruth Pemberton, who was 72 and had known every piece of agricultural land in this valley for 50 years, told her daughter-in-law on the way home that the Hart orchard looked better than it had in 3 years. This piece of observation moved through the community in the organic way such observations do, and within a week 4 different people had mentioned to Gideon, in contexts ranging from the feed store to the church steps, that the farm was looking good. None of them asked directly about Alara. They communicated their curiosity in the sideways manner of people who want information without appearing to want it. A slight pause after a compliment, an unnecessary glance toward the wagon where Gideon's supplies were loaded. He didn't satisfy the curiosity. He thanked them for the compliment and went on with his business. Not everyone's interest was benign. Silas Granger had been to the farm once and been turned away from the gate, and this had apparently decided him that a different approach was needed. He began his second campaign through proxies, a word to the minister about the moral example being set, a quiet mention to the men at the co-op meeting that Gideon's situation was an unusual one that perhaps bore watching. He did these things with the careful indirection of a man who understood that direct confrontation had not worked and was willing to adjust his methods without adjusting his goal. Gideon heard about this from 3 separate sources in the space of 10 days, which was about how long it took for that kind of information to travel in a community this size. He told Alara about it on a Tuesday evening. He was not certain why he told her, perhaps because she had a right to know what was being said, or perhaps because he was tired of being the only one carrying it. She listened without interrupting, her knitting in her lap. He went to the minister, she said. Apparently. What did the minister say? Nothing useful either direction, from what I heard. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. Silas has an old debt he's been holding. From 3 years ago, when Margaret was sick and the farm was going badly. I borrowed from the co-op, he runs the co-op, to cover the medical bills. I've been paying it back. There's still about 8 months of payments left on it. Alara looked at him steadily. He's going to use it. That's what I'd do, if I were a man who did that kind of thing. What's the remaining amount? He told her. She didn't react to the number, just absorbed it and put it somewhere in the mental accounting she was apparently doing. Can you pay it off? Not all at once. Not without... He stopped. He thought about the cellar full of preserves, the repaired drainage, the healthy trees, the horse that was now eating from Alara's hand. He thought about what the farm looked like in October and what it looked like now. Maybe by spring, he said. If the sales go the way I think they will. Silas won't wait until spring if he's decided to move. No. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, There's the quince paste. I told you it sells well in city markets. And the apple butter. There's a grocer in Mill Haven who I know used to carry that quality of preserve and couldn't get enough of it. If you could get a shipment there before Christmas, the timing's right. People buy that kind of thing for the holiday. How do you know about the Mill Haven grocer? Because I worked for a woman 2 positions back who sold there. She picked up her knitting again. It's not a certain thing, but it's a chance at the money you need. He looked at her for a moment, at the practical set of her jaw, at the baby that was visibly pressing against the front of her work apron. Now, at the small hat she was knitting that had gotten larger in the past week and was starting to look like what it was. She was trying to help him solve a problem that had, indirectly, been created by her presence on this farm, and she was doing it with the same matter-of-fact competence she brought to everything. And he felt something that he recognized as gratitude, but was also, underneath the gratitude, something harder to name. All right, he said. I'll drive to Mill Haven on Thursday. He drove to Mill Haven on Thursday with 2 crates of quince paste and 3 of apple butter, and came home with less of both and more money than he'd seen at one time in 2 years. The grocer, a sharp-eyed man named Caldwell, who ran a tight operation and didn't compliment things unless he meant it, had looked at the quince paste label in Alara's handwriting and said, Who put this up? Gideon had said, The woman working my harvest. Caldwell had said, She know what she's doing, which from Caldwell was something close to reverence. He'd placed an order for twice the current quantity to be delivered before December 20th. Gideon told Alara this when he got home. She was in the kitchen doing something with dried apple rings and a large pot, and she turned to look at him from the stove. Twice the quantity, she said. Before the 20th. She turned back to the stove, and he saw her shoulders shift in a way that was almost a laugh, but not quite, more like the release of a breath she'd been holding. We can do that, she said. I'll need 3 more cases of jars. I'll get them tomorrow. The phrase, we can do that, sat in the kitchen between them for a moment, and neither of them remarked on it, but it was there. The next 2 weeks were the hardest work of the whole season, not because it was physically demanding in the way the orchard work had been, but because it was relentless. Alara worked the kitchen from first light to supper, and sometimes past it, and Gideon spent his mornings outdoors and his afternoons doing whatever she needed done. Fetching water, stoking the stove, hauling jars from the cellar, cutting the paper for labels while she pressed and sealed. The kitchen was warm from the canning pot and smelled constantly of apples and spice and hot wax. They moved around each other with the efficiency of people who had been doing this together for 2 months and knew each other's patterns without having to think about it. One afternoon, she dropped a jar. Not a sealed one, an empty jar that she'd just washed, slipping from her hands as she lifted the rack, and it hit the stone floor and broke cleanly in 2. She stood looking at the pieces with an expression that had nothing to do with the jar. He was at the table cutting labels, and he looked up at her. Leave it, he said. I'll clean it. I'll clean it. Sit down. Gideon? Alara. He got up and took the rack from her hands, which she let him do after a moment. Sit down. She sat at the kitchen table. He swept the glass, washed the shards out with a rag, and when he looked up, she had her hands flat on the table and her eyes were closed, and her face had the particular quality of a person fighting off something they're not going to win by fighting. How long has your back been hurting? He said. It always hurts. More than usual. How long? She opened her eyes. Since yesterday morning. She pressed her mouth together. It's not contractions. I know the difference now. It's just... She moved her hand in a vague gesture toward her lower back. The weight of it. Everything's pulling forward. He stood at the kitchen counter. He thought about things he could say and discarded most of them. We can slow the production schedule, he said. We can't. The 20th is... We can adjust it. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. The order's good either way. Colwell wants what we have. We don't have to kill ourselves to double it by the 20th. We fill what we can, and I'll talk to Colwell about the rest coming the week after. She looked at him with the expression she got when she was examining something for flaws. He said the 20th, she said. He said before the 20th. Before has some room in it. Her jaw worked slightly. She was not good at accepting adjustments to plans she'd made, he'd noticed. Not from pride, but from a deep habit of not letting anything slip, of gripping every obligation tightly, because she'd learned that letting go even slightly had consequences. He recognized this in her because he'd had some version of it himself for 2 years. All right, she said finally. We adjust it. Good. He got up and put the kettle on without being asked, and she watched him do this with an expression that he didn't look at directly, because some things you see more clearly from the corner of your eye. The Millhaven order went out on December 17th, 3 days early, with a second delivery scheduled for the 23rd. Colwell sent payment within 2 days. It was, Gideon noted as he counted it out on the kitchen table, enough to cover 6 of the remaining 8 months of the co-op debt in a single payment. He set the money on the table in front of Alara because she'd earned it as much as he had. She looked at it for a long time. Is it enough? She said. She meant for Silas. It's enough to make the conversation different, he said. She put both hands around her coffee cup. Outside the kitchen window, the sky was the particular white of serious cold, and the orchard stood under a light dusting of snow that had come overnight, 3 inches, maybe 4, sitting clean on the branches of the apple trees, covering the ground the way the first real snow covers things, making the farm look briefly like a version of itself that might have existed before things went wrong. She was watching the orchard when she said quietly, I keep thinking about when I have to leave. He didn't answer immediately. You said until the baby comes, he said. That was the arrangement. He looked at the window, too, at the white orchard, at the plum trees on the south slope that she'd told him were healthy and would bear in summer. Arrangements can change, he said, if both people want them to. She turned to look at him. He looked back at her. Neither of them said anything else, and after a moment she turned back to the window, and he picked up his coffee, and the kitchen held the particular silence that comes not from emptiness, but from something that has been said carefully and has landed where it was meant to. Outside, the snow on the orchard branches glittered in the pale winter light, and the trees stood in their rows, bare and patient and quietly alive. The conversation by the kitchen window stayed where it had landed, neither of them picking it up again nor putting it away. It existed in the house the way certain things exist, present, acknowledged in the peripheral way of something too significant to look at directly. Gideon went about his work. Alara went about hers. The days between the 17th of December and Christmas were cold and clear and short, and the farm demanded enough of both of them that there was always a practical reason not to stop and examine what had passed between them over coffee and a snowy window. Silas Granger came to the farm on the 21st. Gideon was in the barn when he heard the wagon on the lane, and he came out to meet it with his hands still dirty from the harness he'd been repairing. Silas climbed down alone this time, which Gideon noted. No son in the wagon seat, no witness. That meant the conversation was intended to be private, which meant it was intended to be the kind of conversation that required no record. Gideon, Silas nodded toward the barn. You got a minute? I've got a harness that needs finishing. This won't take long. Silas pulled his coat tighter against the cold and looked at the house, at the lit kitchen window, at the curl of smoke from the chimney. I've been patient about the situation, you know that. I know you've been persistent. I wouldn't have called it patience. Silas's expression shifted in a way that communicated he'd decided to stop pretending this was a friendly visit. The co-op debt, he said. It's past the point where I can hold it. The board has questions about carrying a note that size for this long. I made a substantial payment 10 days ago. Substantial doesn't mean settled. Silas reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He held it out. The board has voted to call the remainder, full payment within 30 days, or the co-op takes a lien on the orchard property as collateral. Gideon looked at the document but didn't take it. He looked at it the way you look at a thing you've been waiting for and are not surprised by but are not happy about. 30 days, he said. January 20th. He did the arithmetic. The Millhaven payment had been substantial, but the remainder of the debt was still 2 months of installments. He did not have 2 months of installments sitting in the house. He had the December sales and the livestock fund and a thin reserve that Margaret had started in 1889 and that he'd been drawing down slowly since she died. The board, he said. Or you. Silas had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, which was something. The board voted on it. Did they vote, or did you bring it to them as a decision already made and let them sign their names to it? Silas put the document back in his coat. You've got until the 20th, he said. He went back to his wagon. Gideon stood in the barn doorway and watched him go. The cold came down off the north pasture and moved through the yard and found every gap in his coat, and he stood in it for a while before he went back inside. Alara was at the table when he came in. She took one look at his face and put down the jar she was labeling. He came, she said. He came. Gideon hung his coat and went to the stove and stood there with his hands over the heat. He's calling the debt. Full remainder by January 20th, or they take a lien on the property. She was quiet for a moment. How much remains? He told her. She absorbed it without expression. That's not possible in 30 days, she said. Not the way things stand. What do you have? He told her that too. The Millhaven payment, the reserve. What might realistically come in from a second Millhaven delivery before the end of the month. She listened with her elbows on the table and her hands folded, and he could see her doing the arithmetic just as he had done it, arriving at the same conclusion. It's short, she said. About $40 short. She looked at the table. The spring pear sales, she said. If you could get an advance against them. If Caldwell would consider... Caldwell doesn't do advances. He pays on delivery. Gideon sat down across from her. There might be another option. The Pemberton farm to the east. They've been asking about buying the 10 acres I added 2 years back. The scrubland with the creek. It's not productive. I've been holding on to it, but don't sell land, she said immediately. He looked at her. Don't sell land unless you have no other way, she said. Land is what you have left when everything else fails. Selling it to solve a short-term problem is... She stopped. Started again. I watched my father sell a piece of the Valley Orchard in 1887 to cover a bad year. He regretted it every season after. The land you sell doesn't come back. I know that. Then don't do it yet. Her jaw was set. We have 2 weeks before Christmas. The second Millhaven delivery is set for the 23rd. If Caldwell takes more than the order, if we can get him to take another case of the quince paste on top of the order, that closes some of the gap. She pressed her lips together. And I have some money. Not much. I've been putting aside what I could since September. Alara. It's not charity. It's an investment in a farm I've been working for 2 months. She met his eyes directly. I have $32 in the tin in the south room. If you add that to what you have and what comes from the Millhaven delivery, you might get there. I'm not taking your money. It's not a gift. I want it back in the spring when the first orchard sales come in. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she'd told him about the drainage channels and the quince paste grocer in Millhaven, as information, not argument. You've given me a roof for 2 months. You turned Silas Granger away from your gate the first time he came. You adjusted the production schedule so I could rest. She looked at her hands. People don't do those things for someone and then take their money. But I'm not giving it. I'm lending it. And you should take it, because the alternative is watching him win. Gideon sat with this. He sat with it for a long time, looking at the table, at the row of labeled jars by the window, at the place on the floor where she'd dropped the empty jar 2 weeks ago, and he'd swept the pieces. He was not a man who accepted help easily. He had the particular stubbornness of someone who had been managing alone for long enough that accepting help felt like admitting to something. He was never sure what, exactly. A kind of failure. A kind of need he wasn't comfortable owning. All right, he said. All right, you'll take the money? Or all right, you're still thinking about it? All right, I'll take the money. She nodded once, the same contained nod she'd used at the gate in October when she'd decided to accept his offer of the shed, and then she picked up her jar label and went back to work. He looked at the back of her head for a moment, the dark braid, the collar of her work jacket, the set of her shoulders, and felt something he had no language for, which was its own kind of answer to a question he hadn't asked yet. He drove to Mill Haven 2 days later and came back with Caldwell's agreement to take an additional case of quince paste on the 23rd, which was better than he'd hoped. The total, when he counted it all out on the kitchen table on the night of the 22nd, his reserve, the incoming Mill Haven payment, Alara's $32 in their repurposed tin, came to $4 over the required amount. $4. The margin of a single bad decision in either direction. He paid the co-op debt on December 28th. He walked into the co-op office and put the money on Silas Granger's desk and waited while Silas counted it. Silas counted it twice. Paid in full, Gideon said. Silas looked up from the money. His face moved through several things. Surprise, recalculation, something that might have been grudging respect fighting against the dominant preference for neither. You had help, he said. I always had help, Gideon said. I was just too stubborn to use it for a while. He took his receipt and walked out. The drive home was 8 miles and the temperature had dropped steadily since noon, and the sky in the north had taken on a color that he recognized. Not the white of light snow. A deeper gray, almost greenish in a certain light, the kind of sky that meant the weather was not plain anymore. He watched it on the drive, and when he got home, he went to the barn first and made sure the livestock were settled and the water buckets were full and the barn door was properly latched on the inside. Alara was in the kitchen when he came through the back door, and she looked at his face and then looked at the window where the light was going wrong. How bad, she said. Could be bad. He shed his coat. The livestock are in. I need to bring more wood in before it hits. He paused. How are you feeling? Fine. She said it too quickly. He looked at her. She was standing at the counter with her weight shifted to one side in a way she did when her back was troubling her, and her face had a tightness around the eyes that he'd learned to read in the past 2 months. Alara. I had some contractions this afternoon. She held up one hand before he could speak. They slowed down. They've been irregular. It could be nothing. It's too early. She's not due for another 6 weeks. He stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the back hall and looked at her. 6 weeks, he said. Approximately. First babies are often late. She turned back to the counter. Go get the wood in. I'll be fine. He got the wood in. He made 3 trips to the wood pile in the growing dark and stacked the kitchen corner full, and then moved to the parlor and stacked that too. And by his 3rd trip, the wind had shifted direction and the temperature had dropped 10 degrees from where it had been an hour before. The sky was the color of iron, and the first flakes were starting. Not gentle, not exploratory, but the hard driving kind that moves horizontal and means what it says. He came in from the last load and found Alara standing in the middle of the kitchen with both hands pressed against her abdomen, her eyes closed, her breathing slow and deliberate. He put the wood down. That's not Braxton Hicks, he said. She opened her eyes. No, she said. It's not. For a moment neither of them moved. The wind hit the kitchen window and the lamp flame bent sideways and recovered. How long? He said. Since about noon. She let out a slow breath as whatever she was feeling eased. I thought it would stop. It's too early. 6 weeks is too early. He crossed to her. He put his hands on her shoulders. Not in a romantic way, not in any way that required definition, just the specific human act of steadying someone who is trying to stay upright by willpower alone. She didn't step back. Who's the closest person who knows anything about this, he said. Medical? Midwife? Anything. Ruth Pemberton's daughter-in-law, maybe. I heard she helped with a birth 2 summers ago. The Pembertons are 3 miles east. I know where the Pembertons are. He looked at the window. The snow was real now. It had made its decision. The lane to the road was going to be drifted within the hour, and the road to the Pemberton farm was low-lying on the east end, which was the first place ice collected and the last place it cleared. I'm going to get her, he said. The roads. I'll take pitch. The words surprised him slightly as he said them, but they were right. The draft horses were heavier and slower. Pitch was fast, and he'd been going better for 2 weeks, taking the bit from Gideon now, without the fight he used to make. He can handle the conditions better than August. Alara looked at him with something that was fear, and also, underneath it, the particular relief of someone who is in trouble and has found a person willing to move. Don't go fast on the east bend, she said. There's a drainage ditch runs close to the road there. I know the road. I know you know it. I'm saying don't go fast on the bend anyway. He was already moving toward his coat. He pulled it on and turned back to her. Get into the south room. The bed's better than the kitchen chair. Keep the stove going. I left enough wood in the parlor to last till morning. Gideon. Her voice caught him at the back door. He turned. She looked at him from across the kitchen, the lamp between them, the snow pressing at the window, her hand still pressed to her abdomen. Be careful, she said. It came out quieter than she'd intended, and something in the quietness of it was its own kind of declaration. I'll be back before the worst of it hits, he said. He went out into the storm. Pitch was restless in the stall. Horses feel weather changes before people do, and this horse in particular had a nervous intelligence that the bad weather had wound tight. Gideon moved to him slowly, the way Alara had taught him without meaning to teach him, letting the horse feel his presence before demanding anything of it. He put his hand flat on Pitch's neck. We're going east, he said. We'll be quick. The horse moved under his hand and blew air through his nose, and Gideon got the bridle on without a fight, which 3 months ago would have been impossible, and which now felt like something earned. The ride to the Pemberton farm was the worst 3 miles Gideon had covered on horseback in years. The wind was coming straight from the north and driving snow into his face hard enough that he had to tuck his chin against his chest and navigate by memory and fence line more than sight. The road was going fast, fresh snow over the frozen ruts, slick in the low places, drifting in the open stretches. Pitch moved well, reading the ground carefully, and Gideon let him pick his pace on the uncertain sections rather than pushing. He found the east bend without going into the ditch, and was grateful he'd heard Alara's warning, because in the dark and the driving snow, he'd misjudged the road position by several feet. The Pemberton farmhouse had light in the windows. He was off the horse and at the door in under a minute, and when Nora Pemberton, daughter-in-law, 35, competent-faced, opened it and looked at him standing on her porch in the storm, she read the situation immediately. How far along in labor, she said. She started about noon. Baby's 6 weeks early. Nora looked back into the house, making rapid, silent assessments. Let me get my bag, she said. Her husband Seth offered to come, and Gideon said yes without hesitating, because an extra pair of hands in an uncertain situation was not a thing to refuse, and the three of them rode back through the storm. Nora behind Gideon on Pitch, Seth on his own horse, with the wind at their backs now, and the snow coming down hard enough that it filled their tracks almost as fast as they made them. Gideon got them into the farmhouse and went straight to the south room. Alara was on the bed where he'd told her to be, but she had not been resting. She'd pulled several extra quilts from the chest at the foot of the bed and stacked them within reach, and she'd done something he didn't immediately understand. She'd hung a spare lamp from the hook above the washstand and positioned the washstand itself for easy access, and the water pitcher was full. She had prepared the room. Even in labor, in a storm, 6 weeks early, she had prepared the room. She looked up when he came through the door, and he saw the effort it cost her to keep her face from collapsing. You made it, she said. Told you I would. He stepped aside. Nora Pemberton's here. Nora came through the door behind him and went directly to the bed and put her hand on Alara's and said, Let's see what we're dealing with, in the brisk, no-nonsense tone of a woman who had done this before and wasn't frightened by it, and Gideon felt the specific relief of handing a crisis to someone more qualified than himself. I went to the kitchen. He built the fire higher. He put water on to heat. He did these things because they needed doing and because being still was not something he was capable of. Seth Pemberton came and sat at the kitchen table and didn't say much, which Gideon appreciated. The two men drank coffee and listened to the wind working on the house and to the sounds from the south room, which were the particular sounds of something enormous and frightening taking its time. An hour passed. 2. Nora came out once for the hot water, looked at Gideon's face and said, She's working hard. The baby's early, but it's coming right. Both of them are holding. She took the water and went back. Gideon stood at the kitchen window. The storm was at full force now. The lane was gone under snow, the orchard invisible, the whole world reduced to what the lamplight reached and nothing beyond it. He could hear the apple trees from here, the branches moving in the wind, the creak and give of wood under pressure. He thought about Alara saying she's mine, and I wanted her in the firelight in November. He thought about $32 in a tin in the south room and the particular pride it took to offer that and call it a loan. He thought about a woman standing at his gate in a coat that wasn't warm enough, having been turned away by every door in a town 4 miles down the road, asking for shelter without begging, without pleading, with only the clean, precise offer of her skills and the stripped-down dignity of someone who has burned through everything else. He thought about the word arrangements and what he'd meant when he'd said they could change. He was still at the window when Nora appeared in the kitchen doorway. He turned. Her face was not the face of bad news. It was tired and careful, and underneath both of those things, it was the face of someone who had been present for a small miracle of the ordinary kind. The kind that happens in farmhouses in snowstorms, the kind that has no witness but the people in the room. "She's here," Nora said. "Small, very small. But she's breathing." Gideon put both hands on the back of the kitchen chair. "Elara," he said, exhausted. "She's all right." Nora wiped her hands on the cloth she was carrying. "The baby's going to need a lot of care for the next few weeks. She's early, and she's tiny, and she's going to need warmth and feeding around the clock." Her voice was level, honest. "I won't tell you she's out of danger. Early babies are fragile, but she's breathing and she's strong for her size, and her mother fought hard for her." She paused. "You can go in." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps. The south room was warm from the lamp and the heat that had been built in the house all evening, and Elara was against the pillows looking like someone who had been taken apart and put back together not quite the same way, but alive and present. Her braid was completely undone, her hair loose and damp at the temples. She looked up when he came through the door. In her arms was a bundle so small it seemed impossible. An infant wrapped in the quilt from the chest, only her face visible. A face that was the specific red and scrunched intensity of the newly born, announcing its own existence with the seriousness of something that has had to work very hard to get here. Elara looked at him, and then down at the baby, and back at him. "Clara," she said. Her voice was wrecked and quiet and completely certain. "Her name is Clara." He came to the side of the bed. He stood there and looked at the two of them. The woman who had arrived at his gate with nothing, and the child who had arrived in a December storm 6 weeks before anyone was ready. And he felt something move through him that had no clean name, a kind of fracturing open that was not grief, had nothing to do with grief, was its opposite in every way. He put out one hand and touched the baby's cheek with the side of his finger. Her skin was impossibly soft and impossibly warm. "She's very small," he said. "I know." Elara looked down at her. "She's going to be all right." She said it the same way she'd said it to herself in the shed on the first night. "We're all right. We have a roof." The way she said things she needed to believe out loud in order to make them real. Except this time, Gideon thought, she wasn't alone when she said it. "Yes," he said, "she is." Outside, the storm made its full force known, the wind gusting so hard the lamp flame bent nearly flat, the snow pressing against the window in sheets, the old farmhouse taking the force of it and holding, the way it had held for 40 years, through worse nights than this one. And in the south room, in the light of a single lamp, a woman held her daughter for the first time, and a man who had been alone for 2 years, 4 months, and some number of days stood beside the bed, and neither of them had any reason to count anymore. The storm broke sometime before dawn. Gideon knew it before he was fully awake. The quality of silence that followed the wind was its own kind of sound, the absence of pressure against the house walls, the stillness that settles after something violent has exhausted itself. I was in the kitchen chair, head back, having fallen asleep sometime around 3 in the morning with a cold cup of coffee on the table beside him. Nora Pemberton had taken the parlor settee. Seth had gone home through the worst of the storm to check on his own livestock, and said he'd be back at first light with the wagon if the lane was passable. Gideon sat up and listened to the house. From the south room, a thin, reedy sound, small and persistent. Clara, announcing that she was still here. He got up and went quietly to the doorway and looked in. Elara was awake, propped against the pillows, the baby against her chest. She looked up when his shadow crossed the threshold. She had the specific hollowed-out look of someone who had not slept and was not going to sleep soon, and had made their peace with this. "She's hungry," Elara said quietly. "She's been trying." "Is it working?" "Somewhat." She adjusted the baby's position with the careful movements of someone learning a new thing under pressure. "Nora said it takes a few days to establish properly. With a baby this small, it might take longer." She looked down at Clara. "She keeps trying, though. That's something." He looked at the baby. Even in the lamplight, they'd kept the lamp burning through the night, she was visibly small in a way that tightened something in his chest. Her face had lost some of the birthday intensity and was now simply a face, eyes squeezed shut, mouth working. Her hands, when they escaped the quilt, were the size of walnuts. "What do you need?" he said. "More warm water when you can." And she stopped, looked up. The cow, Daisy. Does she have milk? She's dry through January. She calved in October. Alara's face shifted slightly. He saw her doing the arithmetic that he'd already been running in the back of his head since Nora had told him the baby needed feeding around the clock. Bess, he said then, thinking of it. The Pembertons' house cow. She calved 2 months ago. She'll be in full milk. He straightened in the doorway. I'll ask Seth when he comes. She nodded. Her eyes were back on Clara. She's breathing well, Gideon said. He said it because she hadn't asked, and because he could see the question underneath everything she was doing. The constant monitoring, the adjusting, the listening. I can hear her from here. Alara let out a slow breath. I know. I keep counting them. How many? What? How many breaths since you started counting? She looked at him. For just a moment, something in her face came undone at the edges. Not collapse, not tears, just the brief unguarded look of a person who has been holding themselves together very tightly for a very long time and has just been seen doing it. I lost count around 200, she said. Then she's breathing fine, he said. You can stop counting. I went to make the warm water, and behind him in the south room, Alara pressed her cheek against the top of her daughter's head and was quiet. Seth Pemberton arrived at 7:30 with his wagon and news that the main road was passable if you stayed in the center ruts and didn't push the horses. Nora came out of the parlor looking like she'd slept poorly on a settee that deserved the blame, and she went directly to check on Alara and the baby before she'd had so much as a cup of coffee. When she came back to the kitchen, she sat down across from Gideon and put both hands flat on the table. The baby's small, she said. You know that. I want to be straight with you about what that means for the next few weeks. Tell me. She needs to stay warm, consistently warm, not just heated room warm, but held close warm. Skin matters for a baby that early. She needs to be against someone's body as much as possible. Nora wrapped her hands around the coffee cup he'd placed in front of her. She needs milk. Alara's trying, but it may not come in sufficiently for a few days. Early deliveries can make that harder. In the meantime, she needs something. She paused. Fresh cow's milk, thinned slightly with a little warm water, given by spoon or cloth every hour to 2 hours. It's not ideal, but it's kept early babies alive before. Seth can bring Bess, Gideon said. Nora looked at him. The cow. The Pembertons' house cow. She's in milk. Seth from the doorway said, We can bring her today. Keep her in your barn for a few weeks if you need. Nora nodded slowly. That would help. She looked at Gideon again. This is not going to be easy. I want you to understand that. Not because it can't be done, but because it requires a lot of people staying awake and paying attention for a long time. I understand that. She looked at him steadily for a moment, assessing, and seemed to find what she was looking for. All right, she said. Let me show you how to do the spoon feeding before I go. You're going to need to know it. He learned the spoon feeding at the kitchen table with Nora demonstrating on a cloth doll she produced from her bag, and it was fiddlier than it looked. A matter of angle and timing and patience, and the specific restraint of not rushing something that couldn't be rushed. He practiced it until Nora said he had it, and then Nora went to the south room to show Alara, and Gideon stood at the kitchen counter and thought about how 2 months ago the most complicated thing he'd done in this house was heat tinned soup. The Pembertons brought Bess that afternoon, a placid brown and white house cow, with a good temperament and an impressive quantity of milk. Gideon put her in the stall next to Pitch, and Pitch, to everyone's surprise, regarded the new occupant with something approaching indifference rather than his usual territorial displeasure. Either the horse had mellowed significantly in the past 2 months, or he recognized that this was not a situation that called for drama. The first time Gideon milked Bess at the kitchen counter that evening, strained the milk through cloth, warmed it, thinned it with a small measure of warm water the way Nora had specified, and brought the result to the south room on a tray, Alara looked at the cup and spoon and then at him. You milked her yourself, she said. She's in my barn. You've been milking Daisy for years, I know, but Bess is... She tilted her head. She let you. She's a very agreeable cow. He set the tray on the washstand. More agreeable than anything else on this farm. Alara almost smiled at that. Her first real one in 2 days. The days that followed were unlike anything Gideon had experienced, and he had experienced a considerable range of things on this farm and before it. They were not good days in the comfortable sense. They were exhausting, irregular, stripped of anything unnecessary. The household reorganized itself entirely around Clara's needs with the practical efficiency of people who understood that sentiment would not keep a 6-week early baby alive. only consistent action would. Every hour to 2 hours, around the clock, someone was in the south room with the spoon and the warm milk. They divided the night into shifts without discussing it at length. Alara took the first half, Gideon the second, because she was recovering from labor and he was not, and it was simply the more rational division. He came to the south room at 2 in the morning, and she handed him the baby and the spoon with the specific economy of motion of two people who have been doing this long enough to have a system, and he sat in the chair beside the washstand and fed Clara by lamplight while Alara slept. The baby was a serious creature. He had not spent much time with infants before. There had been the hope of children with Margaret, and then the long illness. And after that the question had closed, and he'd had no framework for what they were like. Clara, he discovered, was fiercely present even at this size. When she was awake, her eyes moved, tracking light and shadow with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to her 3 days on Earth. She made her displeasure known without ambiguity. She had opinions about the spoon angle that she communicated through facial expressions alone. "You're a lot of trouble for something this small," he told her on the third night, at 3 in the morning in the lamplight. She opened her eyes and appeared to consider this. "Your mother is worse," he said, "but you're developing the same tendency." Clara made a sound that was not a real sound yet, just the precursor of one, a small intake of breath and release. And he moved the spoon, and she took the milk, and he sat in the chair in the dark, warm room, and felt something that he had no prior experience of and therefore no name for, a particular quality of presence that you only find in the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning when you are responsible for something small and alive, and the rest of the world has gone completely quiet. Nora Pemberton came back on the fourth day and stayed for 2 hours and declared Clara improved, which was a word she used carefully and which therefore carried significant weight. "She's taking more at each feeding," Nora said. She had the baby on her palm, weighing her with the experienced assessment of someone who'd done this enough to have calibrated their hands. "And she's warmer than she was. Who's been holding her?" "Both of us," Gideon said from the doorway. "Good. Keep doing it." She handed Clara back to Alara. "She's not out of the woods, but she's in there fighting." She looked at Gideon. "So is her mother. I want Alara up for short periods starting tomorrow. Just the kitchen and back. She needs to move or she'll stiffen up, and that's its own problem." Alara from the bed said, "I've been telling him that." "And I've been telling her to wait until you said so," Gideon said. Nora looked between them with the expression of someone watching a thing she finds both predictable and slightly amusing. "Compromise seems like a useful skill for the both of you," she said, and picked up her bag. The day Alara came to the kitchen for the first time, 6 days after Clara was born, she moved carefully, one hand on the wall, the baby in the crook of her other arm. She was slow, and she knew it, and she didn't comment on it. She sat at the kitchen table in the chair closest to the stove and looked around the room. Gideon was at the counter. The kitchen was not in the state she'd left it. He was a competent man in many ways, and a limited one in others. And the particular domestic architecture she'd built in that room over 2 months had suffered somewhat in her absence. There were dishes that had been washed but stacked imprecisely. The preserving jars on the counter had been moved to make room for the milk warming operation, and not entirely moved back. There was a corner of the table that had accumulated several days of miscellaneous items, a harness buckle, 2 receipts, a length of wire, that did not belong in a kitchen at all. She looked at all of this. "The buckle is on the table," she said. "I was mending the harness." "In the kitchen." "It was cold in the barn." She looked at him. He looked at her. Clara made the precursor of a sound. "All right," Alara said, and she was definitely almost smiling. "Give me a week." He moved the buckle. She sat at the table every morning after that, longer each day, and the kitchen reasserted its previous order around her in the organic way that a space resumes the habits of the person who inhabits it. By the end of the second week, she was cooking again. Not the full production of the preserving season, but daily meals, the kind of cooking that maintains a household rather than transforms it. Gideon ate actual food again after 2 weeks of his own cooking, which had been serviceable in the manner of a man who views eating primarily as maintenance. He did not tell her that he'd missed her cooking specifically, but he ate 3 servings of the potato soup she made on a Thursday evening, and she noted this without comment. Clara grew. Not quickly, not in any way that could be called dramatic. She grew the way early things grow, incrementally, with setbacks. 2 days of vigorous feeding followed by a day of listlessness that put both adults on edge, until she rallied. She gained weight in the careful way of someone who is working hard at a basic task. By the end of the third week, she had filled out enough that the first desperate fragility had begun to soften into something less terrifying, and Nora, on her weekly visit, put her on the postal scale she'd borrowed for the purpose, and announced the number with a satisfaction that made Alara press both hands over her mouth. "She's gaining," Nora said. "Steadily. That's what you want to see." "I want to hear her cry," Alara said. "A real cry. She makes sounds, but she hasn't," as if in response to this, or perhaps in the coincidental way that babies occasionally do the thing being discussed. Clara opened her mouth and produced a sound that was small and wavery and undeniable. Not the powerful announcement of a full-term infant. Something thinner, higher, more tentative, but real, unmistakable. Alara made a sound of her own that had nothing tentative about it. Gideon was in the doorway, and he turned to look at the window instead of at either of them, which was the Hart family way of managing emotion, and it worked less well than usual. The household that January was nothing like any household Gideon had previously inhabited. It was louder than a farmhouse with one person should be, and more irregular. And there were items on every surface that had not been there before. The small garments Alara had knitted in November, now in constant rotation, the cloth squares used for feeding, the lamp that stayed burning through the night in the south room, the postal scale Nora had lent them, sitting on the kitchen counter, weighed each morning with the solemnity of a ritual. It was also warmer, not in the practical temperature sense, though the stoves were well maintained, in the other sense, the one that comes from a house having more than one heartbeat in it, from there being sound in the morning before you've made any yourself, from there being someone to tell when the cow gave more than usual, or when the ice on the lane was worse than yesterday. He had not known how cold the house had been until it wasn't anymore. One evening in the third week of January, Alara came to the parlor after the late feeding. Clara was down, which was the particular terminology they had adopted, a militaristic phrase that made it sound like something had been achieved by strategy rather than luck. And she sat in her chair by the fire and picked up the knitting she'd set aside before Christmas, which was no longer a small hat, but had become something larger and more ambitious, a blanket in dark blue that she worked on in the incremental way she did everything. Gideon was in his chair with the farm accounts. They sat in the fire's light and did their separate things, the silence between them. The particular easy silence of people who have been through enough together that quiet is no longer something to fill. He looked up at one point and she was watching Clara through the open parlor door, where they'd moved the cradle so the fire would warm the room. The baby was asleep on her back with her arms above her head in the posture of total infant surrender. "She looks bigger," he said. "She is bigger." Alara's voice was soft. "Half a pound since Nora's last visit." "That's good. That's very good." She turned back to her knitting. "Nora said if she keeps this rate through February, she won't need the spoon feeding anymore. She'll take it herself." He nodded. He watched Alara's hands on the needles, the same hands that had cleaned a chimney flue on her first night and sewn up a broken harness strap in the barn and preserved 114 jars of fruit and delivered $32 onto the kitchen table and held an early baby through the coldest December night this valley had seen in years. "You should stay," he said. The needles stopped. He had not planned to say it. Or rather, he had been planning to say it in a different way, at a different time, with more careful architecture around it. But the words had come out plain and direct, which was probably how they should come out. Alara looked at him. "Past the arrangement," he said. "Past when you said you'd move on." He looked at the fire. He was not good at this. He had not practiced this, and he had no recent experience to borrow from. "The farm needs someone who knows what they're doing with it. The orchard. I know the physical work, but I don't know the orcharding the way you do. The Millhaven account won't maintain itself. There's the spring planting to think about, and the plum trees that need pruning, and the—" "Gideon," she said quietly. He stopped. She was watching him with the direct, patient expression she used when she was waiting for a person to catch up to the thing they were actually trying to say. He looked at her. "I'm not asking because of the farm," he said. A beat of silence. "I know," she said. The fire shifted, settling into itself, sending up a brief light that moved across the room and across both of their faces and then steadied. Outside the parlor window, the January dark was complete. No wind tonight, the cold a still and serious thing, the kind that freezes everything exactly as it stands and holds it there. "I don't know what I'm offering exactly," he said. "I'm not good at—" I don't have the words for it. Margaret always said I said too little and meant too much, and she wasn't wrong about that. Elara set the knitting in her lap. You came out in a blizzard at 10 o'clock at night, she said. You learned to spoon-feed an infant at 3 in the morning. You moved a cow into your barn, and you never once asked me to thank you for any of it. She paused. You say plenty, Gideon, just not with words. He looked at her. She looked back. I'll stay, she said. It was quiet and completely certain in the way she said the things she had decided. We'll figure out the rest as it comes. He nodded. He went back to the accounts because there was nothing to add to that, and adding to it would have diminished it. And Elara went back to her knitting, and in the cradle by the door, Clara slept with her arms above her head and her chest moving in the steady, reliable rhythm of someone who has decided to stay too. The last week of January brought a thaw. Not the full spring kind, but the false one that comes in winter sometimes. 3 or 4 days of relative warmth that softens the ice and floods the lane and makes you think, however briefly, that the worst is behind you. The orchard in the thaw revealed itself. Bare trees, black branches against a gray sky. The south fence apples standing clean and properly shaped from Elara's November pruning. The pear block showing the corrected drainage in the way the ground held the meltwater at the surface instead of puddling at the roots. Gideon walked the orchard on a Tuesday afternoon in that thaw, the first time he'd walked it just to look since before autumn. He went row by row, looking at the trees the way Elara had taught him to look at them. Not just for damage, but for potential, for the shape of what they'd be in spring. The plum trees on the south slope were where she'd said they were, with the iron marker stakes Margaret had put in. 3 trees, mid-size, well-branched. They had small, tight buds already forming. The earliest trees were beginning the slow, internal process of spring that started weeks before anything was visible on the outside. He stood at the plum trees for a while. Then he went back to the house, and through the kitchen window he could see the lamplight, and Elara at the table, and the cradle beside her chair, and it was all where it was supposed to be. The false thaw lasted 4 days, and then winter came back, as it always does in that country, to remind everyone that February had not yet finished with them. But it was a different kind of cold from December, less violent, more resigned, the cold of a season that knows it is losing ground even as it holds on. The days were getting longer by minutes that accumulated into something you could actually feel by the end of the month, and the light in the kitchen at 5:30 in the morning was no longer the absolute dark of December, but a deep gray that carried, just barely, the suggestion of what was coming. Clara grew into that lengthening light. The way early things grow when the conditions finally begin to cooperate, steadily, with a seriousness of purpose that Gideon had come to think of as her defining characteristic. By the first week of February, she had abandoned the spoon entirely and made her preferences about feeding known with a directness that was, as far as he could tell, entirely inherited. By the 3rd week, she had discovered that her hands were attached to her body, and spent significant portions of her waking hours examining this fact with the intensity of a researcher onto something important. Nora Pemberton came on a Tuesday in late February, weighed Clara on the postal scale, and said, "She's caught up enough. I'm not worried anymore." She said it plainly, without ceremony, which was exactly the right way to say it, because the worry had been plain and without ceremony too, and it deserved its ending in the same register. Elara sat at the kitchen table after Nora left and held Clara, and didn't say anything for a while. Gideon washed the coffee cups at the basin. The February light came through the window at a new angle, hitting the row of preserve jars on the shelf and finding the amber in them. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong," Elara said. He dried his hands on the towel. "Something will. It usually does." She looked up at him. He sat across from her. "But not today," he said. "Today she's caught up, and Nora's not worried. You can have that for today without it needing to last forever." She looked down at Clara. The baby had hold of her finger and was applying the full force of her concentration to it. "I'm not good at that," Elara said. "Having things." She was quiet for a moment. Having things without waiting for them to be taken back. He understood this in the specific way you understand something you have also lived. 2 years of managing a dying farm alone had taught him a version of the same lesson, the way you stop expecting improvement because expecting it, and then not getting it, costs more than not expecting it at all. The way you make yourself small inside your own life, so that when the next loss comes, it has less to take. "You put $32 on my kitchen table in December," he said. "You called it a loan." "It was a loan. You knew I might not be able to pay it back. The farm might not have made it, She met his eyes. I knew it might not. That's having something without a guarantee, he said. You've been doing it longer than you think. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked back at Clara, and the baby looked back at her with the unblinking focus of the very young. And something in the room shifted quietly, the way the light had been shifting for weeks. Incrementally, without announcement, in the direction of something better. March came in hard and went out soft, which is the way of March in that country, a month that cannot decide what it wants to be and ultimately becomes both. The mud season turned the lane into a problem that required 2 boards laid lengthwise for anyone wanting to get a wagon through without losing a wheel to the ruts. The livestock were restless after months of barn confinement. The sheep needed moving to the east pasture as soon as the ground would hold them, and the draft horses were developing the particular edginess of animals that have been stalled too long and need work. Pitch was different. Gideon noticed it first, and then Alara confirmed it without being asked, the way she confirmed most things she'd been observing for a while and waiting for him to catch up to. The horse had come, over the winter months, into a kind of settled ease that none of the farmhands who'd tried to work with him had ever achieved. He took the bit without resistance. He stood for grooming without pinning his ears. He had not kicked a stallboard since November, and when Gideon brought him out into the yard on the first workable day of March, and put him to the light harrow on the east field, Pitch moved through the work with a steadiness that was almost unfamiliar on an animal that had once been defined by his unreliability. "What did you do to that horse?" Seth Pemberton said, when he came to help turn the east field, and watched Pitch work the headlands without incident. "Nothing," Gideon said. "She did." He nodded toward the house where Alara was visible through the kitchen window. "Spent about 3 weeks just standing near him, talking, not asking anything." Seth watched the horse. "That's it?" "That's most of it." Gideon turned the harrow at the fence line. "She said he was scared, not mean. Said you have to let scared things tell you when they're ready." Seth was quiet for a moment, watching the horse. "Smart woman," he said. "Yes," Gideon said, "she is." The orchard declared itself in the first week of April. It did not do this modestly. After the pruning and the drainage work and the soil treatment and the long winter of not dying, the trees came into blossom with an exuberance that Gideon had not seen on this land in years. Not since the good years of the mid-'80s when his father was still alive, and the orchard was what it had always been intended to be. The south fence apples went first, the ones Alara had pruned in November, and then the pears along the corrected drainage channels. And then, on a Thursday morning in the second week of April, while the light was still the pale gold of early morning, the 3 plum trees on the south slope opened. Gideon saw them from the barn. He stopped what he was doing and looked at them for a long time. Then he went to the house. Alara was at the table feeding Clara, who had developed strong opinions about the pace of this activity and was currently expressing them. She looked up when he came in. "The plum trees," he said. She understood immediately. "All 3?" "All 3. She stood up, adjusting Clara against her shoulder, and went to the kitchen window. The south slope was visible from there on a clear morning, and this was a clear morning, and the 3 plum trees stood in their white blossom against the sky that was doing its best. April work, the iron marker stakes at their bases, the only indication that anyone had ever worried about them. She stood at the window for a while without saying anything. He stood beside her. "Margaret would have liked this," she said carefully. She said it the way she said things she wasn't certain were hers to say. Not tentatively, exactly, but with care. He looked at the trees. "She planted them for the fruit," he said. "She liked plums. Practical reason." He paused. "She would have been glad they made it." "They made it because you kept them." "I kept them because I didn't have a reason not to yet." He looked sideways at her. "You gave me the reason." She turned from the window. Claire had settled against her shoulder with the specific density of an infant who has decided it is time to sleep regardless of whether this is convenient, and Alara's hand moved in the small automatic circle on the baby's back that she had been doing since December, and would probably do for the rest of her life. "I need to write to Caldwell," she said. "The spring apple harvest is going to be better than we projected. He should know." Alara. "And the pear block. The drainage held through the snowmelt, so we should have a full yield on the late pears, which we didn't factor into." "Alara." He said it again, not sharp, just enough to stop the forward motion. She stopped, looked at him. He reached out and put his hand over hers, the one on Clara's back, briefly, and then took it away because he was who he was, and large gestures were not a language he'd ever learned to speak. "The letter to Caldwell can wait an hour," he said. She looked at him. At his face, which was the face of a man who had been alone for 2 years and 4 months and some number of days that he no longer needed to count, weathered by the specific combination of outdoor work and indoor grief that marks certain people permanently. Not handsome in any conventional sense, but entirely and recognizably itself. She had been looking at this face across the breakfast table and the supper table, and over coffee in the evenings for 5 months now, and she knew it well enough to read what it was doing when it wasn't saying anything. "All right," she said, "an hour." He went to the back room and came out with a small rectangular box made of pine, plain and unadorned, which he set on the kitchen table. She looked at it. "What is this?" she said. "Something I made in January, during the nights." He pushed it toward her. "When Clara was up, and you were sleeping, and I had something to do with my hands." She shifted the sleeping baby to her other arm and opened the box. Inside, nestled in a piece of folded cloth, was a small carved figure. An apple tree, rendered in the dark walnut wood from the scrap pile in the barn. The branches individually shaped, the root system visible at the base. It was not polished or perfect. The bark texture was uneven in places where the chisel had skipped. One branch was slightly heavier than symmetry required, but the tree was unmistakably alive in the way that things made by hand sometimes are. It had the quality of something that had been paid attention to. She looked at it for a long time. "I'm not a woodworker," he said. "You can see that." "I can see it took a long time," she said. "Clara's a reliable reason to stay up." She looked at him, and then at the tree, and then she set it carefully on the table beside her coffee cup, where it would be in her eye line. "I'll keep it in the south room," she said, "on the washstand." He nodded. She looked at him again, longer this time, and he did not look away. Silas Granger came to the farm on a Saturday afternoon in the last week of April, and this time he came alone and on foot, which was how you came to a place when you had no authority left and knew it. He came to the gate and stopped there, and Gideon came out to meet him, and the two men stood on either side of the fence in the spring afternoon with the orchard blossoming behind Gideon and the lane stretching back toward town behind Silas. "The debt's paid," Silas said. He said it without preamble. He had apparently decided that the time for indirection was finished. "It's been paid since December," Gideon said. "I know." Silas looked at the orchard. Something moved in his face that was not quite remorse, but was in the neighborhood of it. The look of a man who has run a strategy to its conclusion and found the conclusion less satisfying than the anticipation. The co-op board was asking about the spring accounts. They'd heard the Millhaven sales. Caldwell mentioned the Hart Orchard to someone. He paused. "Word gets around." "It does." Silas looked at the gate, at the lane, at somewhere that wasn't Gideon's face. "I was wrong to use the debt the way I did," he said. "It came out flat and practiced, the way apologies come from men who are not accustomed to making them and have had to rehearse. I thought I was protecting the community's interests. I understand now that I was protecting my own comfort." Gideon looked at him. He took the measure of this the way he took the measure of most things, looking for what was true in it, what was performed, what the difference was between the man who'd brought his son as a witness in October and the man standing alone at his gate in April. "I appreciate you saying it," Gideon said. He did not say it was fine, because it wasn't entirely fine, and they both knew it, and pretending otherwise would have cheapened whatever this was. "The woman you tried to run off my property is the reason this orchard is alive. You should know that." Silas nodded. He looked once more at the blossoming trees. "It does look good," he said, and this at least was genuine. A man who knew orchards well enough to mean it. He turned and walked back down the lane. Gideon watched him go and felt none of the satisfaction he'd expected to feel, which was its own kind of information. He'd spent 4 months at some level waiting for this moment, for the vindication of it, and now that it was here it felt ordinary, almost beside the point. What Silas thought or said or admitted had stopped mattering sometime around January, somewhere between the 2 o'clock feedings and the weight checks in the evenings by the fire. And he hadn't noticed the exact moment it had stopped mattering, which was probably how it should go. I went back into the orchard. He walked the rows the way Alara had taught him to walk them. Not just looking at what was there, but at what was coming, at the shape of the thing in time. The blossoms were past their peak on the apple trees, the petals falling now in the light wind, settling on the dark ground beneath the branches. The fruit was setting, tiny, hard, barely visible in the clusters where the flowers had been. Months away from anything, requiring all of spring and most of summer to become what they were going to be. He thought about patience, which was a thing he had always believed he understood, and was beginning to understand differently. There is the patience of endurance, the gritted teeth, head-down kind that gets you through winter and grief and debt, and the particular slow disaster of a farm failing. He'd had that kind. He'd used it up and refilled it and used it again. But there was another kind, the kind Alara had with Pitch in the barn stall, the kind she'd had at his gate in October. The patience of someone who is not simply enduring but is present, watching, waiting for the right moment with their eyes open rather than closed. The patience that is a form of attention rather than a form of survival. He had been learning this second kind since October, and he was still learning it, and he suspected it was the kind you never finished learning. Alara was on the porch when he came back from the orchard. Clara was in the cradle they'd moved outside for the first time, a tentative concession to the warmth of the April afternoon, and Alara was in the porch chair with her knitting, which had become a blanket in dark blue that was nearly finished now. She looked up when his boots hit the porch steps. "Silas?" she said. It was not a question. He came. He said what he needed to say. She looked at him carefully. And it was fine. He sat on the porch step, his back against the post. "Less than I thought it would be." "Things usually are," she said. "The version you fight in your head is always bigger than the actual one." He looked out at the orchard, at the petals falling, at the lane where Silas had walked away. He said, "The Millhaven account has been noticed. Colwell mentioned us to someone." "I know. Colwell wrote to me about expanding the order for fall." She said this without particular drama, in the manner of a person delivering a piece of information they've been waiting for the right moment to deliver. "He wants to be the primary buyer for the Hart Orchard's preserved goods. Exclusive arrangement, first right on the apple butter and the quince paste. The price he's offering is better than the co-op rate by about 15%. He looked at her. "You were going to tell me this when?" he said. "When you got back from wherever Silas had sent you in your head." She turned a row of knitting. "The letter came Wednesday. I wanted to read it a few times before I said anything, because 15% is significant, and I wanted to make sure I wasn't misreading it." "Were you misreading it?" "No." He sat with this for a moment. 15% on the volume they were projecting for fall was not a small number. On top of the spring sales, it was the kind of number that meant the farm was not merely surviving, but was doing the thing farms are supposed to do, which is to sustain the people who tend them. "Write back and say yes," he said. "I was going to." "I know you were." She almost smiled at that. Clara stirred in the cradle and made the precursor of a sound that had become, over 4 months, one of the most familiar sounds in the house. The small announcement of waking, of need, of continued presence. Alara set down her knitting and lifted the baby, settling her in the automatic way that had replaced the careful deliberateness of the early weeks. Clara looked out in the orchard with the particular unfocused focus of a 4-month-old who sees everything and makes sense of very little and appears to find all of it interesting anyway. The petals came down in the light wind and one landed on the blanket she was wrapped in, white against the dark blue, and she tracked it with her eyes. "She sees it," Alara said. "She sees everything," Gideon said. "She's got your eyes." Alara looked down at her daughter. "My mother's," she said quietly. "She had dark eyes, too." She paused. "I think she'd have liked this. Clara, this place." She said the last 2 words carefully, with a weight in them that he understood was not just about the farm. He looked at the woman on his porch, the woman who had arrived at his gate with a canvas bag and a set jaw and a baby that wasn't born yet, and the particular kind of courage that does not look like courage because it cannot afford to perform itself, because it is too busy being real. He thought about all the versions of his life in which she had turned left at the crossroads instead of right, or not asked in town about farms needing help, or been turned away at his gate along with every other door that had closed in her face that day. The improbability of the specific sequence of events that had brought her to this porch in this April light with this child in her arms was the kind of thing that could undo a person if they looked at it too long. He didn't look at it too long. He looked at what was in front of him. "I've been thinking about the south room," he said. She looked at him. "It's small," he said, "for the 2 of you. As she gets bigger, she's going to need more space." He was looking at the orchard when he said this, which was the Hart family way of saying something that mattered. Sideways, toward the middle distance, trusting the other person to hear it directly. There's a room on the north side that gets good light in the morning. I thought we could move your things there. It's bigger, has a second window. She was quiet for a moment. And Clara? I was thinking the south room could stay hers, when she's old enough to use it herself. Elara looked at the orchard. You'd need to put a shelf up, she said. I can put a shelf up. 2, actually, for the books. You have books? I'll have books. She said it simply, in the way she said things she had decided, and he understood that she was saying more than shelves and more than books. She was saying, I am unpacking. I am making room. I am not keeping one eye on the door anymore. He nodded. 2 shelves, then. She looked at him. He looked at her. Between them, Clara looked at the falling petals with the absolute uncomplicated attention of someone who has no prior experience of the world, and therefore finds all of it remarkable. And neither of the adults said anything else for a while because there wasn't anything left to say that hadn't already been said in the ways that mattered. The spring moved through April and into May. The way spring does when you have reason to notice it. Not as weather, but as event. Each day its own particular version of the larger change. The east pasture greened up, and the sheep moved out. The plum trees set fruit on all 3, small green beads among the leaves, and Gideon checked them every few days with the attentiveness of someone monitoring something important. Pitch worked the spring plowing with Seth Pemberton's horse on the shared fields, and the 2 animals worked the rows together without incident. And Seth said afterward that Pitch was the best behaved horse on the lane, and Gideon said that wasn't saying much, and they both laughed, which was something that had happened more this spring than in the 2 previous years combined. The canvas bag was still in the south room until the morning of the 14th of May. Elara had moved most of her things to the north room over the preceding weeks. The knitting, the small carved tree Gideon had made in January, the books that had begun to arrive in 1s and 2s as she'd written to a second-hand seller in the city and made small orders. The room had become hers in the organic way rooms do when someone inhabits them with any intention. The particular way the morning light hit the 2 new shelves, the specific order of the books on them, the quilt she'd chosen from the cedar chest for the bed. But the canvas bag had stayed, not forgotten. Present, in the corner by the door, where she could see it from the bed. She had been aware of it the way you are aware of a thing you have not yet decided about, or have decided about, and have not yet acted on. The bag was habit and history, and the specific insurance of someone who has learned to be ready to move. It had been with her since before the baby, since the household in the South, where everything had come undone, and it had been with her through the boarding house and the 4 miles on foot, and the gate in October and all the months since. It was worn at both straps, and the brass buckle had a scratch on it that she'd gotten somewhere in the 2nd month on the farm when she'd knocked it against the barn door frame. She picked it up on a Tuesday morning in May while Clara slept in the south room, and the house was quiet. She set it on the bed and opened it. There was not much left in it. A few things she hadn't moved because they were small and she'd forgotten them, and the bag itself, which she'd kept available in the way of something you haven't formally given up. She took out what was in it and put those things in the north room where they belonged, and then she stood with the empty bag in her hands. She folded it. She put it in the bottom drawer of the dresser, under the extra quilt. Not thrown away. She wasn't sentimental about objects, but she was honest about what things meant, and this one had kept her moving when she needed to move, and she was not going to discard it like it had been a mistake. But the drawer was the right place for it now. Present, but not necessary. She closed the drawer. She went downstairs. Gideon was in the kitchen. He looked up from the harness he was mending, this time on the kitchen table, because some things do not change and she had stopped fighting this particular battle, which was itself a form of being home. He looked at her face and then at her hands, which were empty. The bag, he said. Bottom drawer, she said, under the extra quilt. He looked at her. She looked at him. You want coffee, he said. Yes, she said. He got up and put the kettle on, and she sat at the table in the chair that had become hers over 5 months of breakfasts and suppers, and late nights and early mornings. And from upstairs came the small sound of Clara beginning to wake, the first tentative announcement of the day. There are people who arrive at a place and know immediately that it is theirs. Elara Whitmore was not one of those people, and she would not have trusted herself if she had been. She had arrived at the Heart Orchard with nothing and had expected nothing, because expecting things had cost her too much, and she had been careful with her expectations for a long time. What she had found here she had not expected and could not have predicted, and did not entirely have words for, which seemed right to her, because the things that matter most are usually the ones that resist simple description. She had found a man who moved toward things rather than away from them when it counted. She had found trees that could be saved if you understood what they needed. She had found that a house could go from empty to inhabited, not through any single event, but through accumulation: a cleaned flue, a sealed window, a lamp left burning, 200 breaths counted in the dark. She had found that belonging was not a door you walk through, but a thing you build, day by day, with your own hands, in the imperfect and unglamorous way of anything real. She had found her daughter in the worst storm the valley had seen in years, in a room with white curtains, in a house that had been dying, and the daughter had fought for her own life with the seriousness of someone who intended to stay, and that intention had changed the quality of everything. She had found that she was allowed to stop running, not because the world had become safe. It had not. It would not. It never entirely does. But because she had found a place and a person worth the risk of staying, and because the canvas bag in the bottom drawer was not a surrender, but a choice, made clear-eyed and without illusion, in the full understanding of what it meant. From upstairs, Clara's voice gathered itself into something more definite, more insistent, the sound of a person who knows what she needs and has people who will come. Alara pushed her chair back. "I'll get her," she said. She went up the stairs, and the stairs were solid under her feet, and the house held around her, and in the kitchen the kettle began to whistle in the morning light of a May day in an orchard that was alive and growing, and Gideon Hart stood at his stove and listened to the sound of his household waking up, and did not count the days anymore, because there was no longer any need. Outside, the apple trees stood in their rows in the spring light, past blossom now, and into the serious work of making fruit, their branches full and purposeful, reaching in every direction at once. Not perfect, not without their scars, but bearing. Bearing whatever the season asked of them, rooted deep in ground that had been tended and difficult and worth it, as things worth having always are.